Hey everyone, long time no see. Part two. This sort of assumes you've seen part one. You can still follow along even if you haven't, but some things might not make as much sense. How should we see Seven Cheap Things in historiographical context? How do we understand it in the context of the class, of everything we've been reading and talking about so far? I've asked you a bunch of questions about this, your prompt for this week, so I'm not going to go through those particular questions and so on. They're fairly clear. The main thing, if I can just put it into one sentence, think about how Popkin would describe it as borrowing from various historical traditions that he described. Apply Maz's questions that highlight differences in postmodern history versus the kind of stuff that Popkin mostly describes. 2 points I want to make about its place in the historiographical tradition. The use of history as proof, not proving a particular historical claim, that's a different thing, but the use of history as proof for something else, and questions of historical agency. Those are the two main topics for this part. As the reading for this week points out, there's very little that's absolutely new if you just look at the chapters individually. People have studied human rights abuses, cheap lives. People have studied how nature has been exploited for capital gain and human comfort. Cheap nature. People have studied the history of labor, cheap work. People have studied, healthcare systems, cheap care, and so on. People have studied the high cost of cheap food, strawberries, for instance, in terms of the environment, in terms of worker rights, and so on. So there's very little in this book that's absolutely new in terms of here's the implications of the system that we use. So what is new? I think one of the new things is how it's all put together to sort of identify these crises of capitalism and the role of cheapness in facilitating these crises, how these crises are solved by frontiers, and how we might be running out of all of these things. And then what happens? We read a while ago about micro and macro histories, and this is obviously on the macro scale. And as with the historians writing in the early 20th centuries, I think it's the second generation of the Annales school, their premise is that you get a perspective on modern society and the past, but the modern society too, that you can't get by just looking at, less geography or less chronology, right? You can't just zoom in on a particular place in time and get the broader sense of how things are changing. Obviously, that's a very particular way of approaching history that we've read about. And that is a particular kind of history, right? With a long period of time and a huge geography as central to what's going on. But one question we can ask about this book is, do you need history to make their point? What are they trying to do? Well, it's this world ecology, capitalism, crises, frontiers, all the stuff I just said. Do you need history to make that point? Can't you just say this is how things work and point to the last 5 or 10 years of examples? How valuable are the historical examples to making their point about contemporary society? Have they proved anything in terms of history? Have they given you enough evidence to support their claims? I don't think so. Not at all. But on the other hand, how do you prove anything in history? There's always stuff you don't know. There's always sources you haven't looked at that would be relevant. There's always sources that didn't survive that would have told you a different side of the story. How much evidence is ever enough? We've had this discussion before. Remember, historical fact versus interpretation, right? It's relatively easy to agree on historical fact. Columbus showed up at this place, this time, surveyed the land, wrote some stuff down about it. We can agree on those facts. It's much harder to put those facts together and say, here's what's happening. Here's what Columbus was thinking, and here's how he was trying to cheapen the things that he found there, and how he was trying to immediately exploit them. That was the main goal from the beginning. That's an interpretive statement, right? That's not a fact. We can disagree on that. We can't disagree that he showed up and wrote something down in his journal. All right, that's pretty well set. So my point is that this could have been a very different book, much more in terms of philosophy. They could have debated the ethical and theoretical questions of how much human suffering gets reflected in prices of goods and services. They could hypothesize whether there could ever be regulation or legislation that requires an explanation of cheapness, like nutrition labels that tell you what's in your crackers. Imagine that there's a box that tells you why the product costs what it does. Where are they spending money in the process? What are they paying the workers? What kind of ingredients are they getting? How much does it cost to fly stuff around the world? What chemical plants are they using to put the preservatives in it? All the different stuff that goes into the cost of something. paying, community farmers for their local produce or whatever the costs are. Will we ever have transparency about why things cost? No, absolutely not. But you can sort of argue philosophically about why that would be useful or why that would not be useful. And you can make, in many ways, the same points that the book makes without using any history. So why use history? What are they doing it for? Because they're trying to show through history, again, this is using history to prove something else that's not even historically related. They're trying to show that there is an ongoing force in the world. Sort of these crises of capitalism, capital flows need to be sort of unlocked and sort of expanded. These are embedded in the world and in culture in ways that we can't see if we're just researching, the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years. You really need to see that it's been happening for a long time everywhere, right? That is the way they're interpreting the history. And if you see it that way, you're going to ask very different questions about what should we do going forward. We're going to approach, problems and crises that we have, not in terms of the ways that they have in the past, finding new frontiers, finding new ways to make things cheaper. You need different solutions. So they're using history to show it's this huge monumental problem, right? You can't make that point without, talking about 500 years of history to show this sort of embeddedness of this world ecology, right? So they have to establish this very, very complicated thing. The premise is that this holistic historical perspective, this long history, this systemic thinking about the present as a result of historical forces is valuable even outside direct proof of causation. So in their view, we can criticize them for not proving anything in terms of the history, but I would say it's their view that they don't need to prove any of this stuff happened because they're showing that there's enough evidence that this thing exists. It's a plausible interpretation. And if it's at least a plausible interpretation, now you can reject the whole thing and say, no, these guys are crazy. But if you think it's even a plausible interpretation, even if they haven't proved it, even if they haven't given you enough evidence, or that you're only getting one side of the story, if you think it's possible that they're right, maybe you're going to ask different questions about the cheapness of these things in the present. Maybe you're going to approach solutions in a different way. That's their hope, obviously. So whether they've proved anything historically is irrelevant, right? Because the goal isn't to make that kind of historical proof, as is the case for most academic history. They're trying to give weight to their theory about the present based on their reading of the past. So history becomes proof of what's happening now, and it gives us a different perspective, according to them, of what we should do about it. So note the power here of historical precedent. And I would argue that kind of technique of using history to give weight to an argument or theory about right now. Look, here's what's happening right now, and we can see historically this has been developing for a long time. That kind of trope we see all the time in all kinds of history, academic, popular, radical popular, doomsday literature. We see this historical force. History is used to make something seem more important, more dire, more complex than we might think otherwise, right? It's used to give weight to a particular worldview. So what do? Well, thinking back to part 1, read generously to see how that kind of perspective might be useful, given all the other issues with it. Read critically to see how much the history really matters. How much is it necessary for them to establish that this history stuff really matters? If they're right, that all this history has sort of contributed to this system, what are we going to do about it at this point? Is it really possible to do anything? And if they're wrong, and therefore it's a more recent problem, and maybe we can act on it more quickly, well, they're still wrong, right? So then why should we do anything? So it's a very weird kind of history, right? Because you're kind of screwed either way. But the point, though, as I said in part 1, is that perspective that can help you ask different questions. And I think that's a very powerful reason for any book to exist. If it gives you a different way of thinking about something, even if you think it's totally crazy, if you keep it in mind, at some point, it's going to be useful, even if it's to sort of support the opposite view, right? But building different perspectives, different arguments, different kinds of evidence only makes us better at understanding not just the past, but the present. The second point, last point I want to make in this part about historiographical traditions is questions of historical agency. We read in Maza, chapter 1, History of Who. History has typically been about people. Eventually it was about nations. Postmodern history, Maza talks about how it becomes more about social history, history from below, that kind of stuff. History normally focuses on relatively distinct historical actors. We've also seen more recent history focus on history of science, history of the environment, and that kind of thing. So we can study people, we can study nations, we can study science, we can study a lot of different kinds of things. We've seen that in Maza in particular. This book is doing a different kind of thing in terms of history, because not only the history of who, the history is of capitalism itself. And it's not just a history of capitalism. Obviously, it's not a good, balanced history of capitalism, as pointed out previously. But the interesting thing about capitalism here is that this capitalist world ecology system that it describes is a direct historical actor that is shaping / making history. It is not just the people doing things, as is typical in historic formulations. Even histories of science talk about not science as this objective thing, but scientists and people who use that data. There's still people is really anchored here. But in this book, there's really very few people. I mean, this Columbus shows up all over, but there's very few people, and it's really about the system. And for me, I think of capitalism generally as a facilitator of exchange, right? It allows economic prosperity. It allows, it allows you to minimize the wealth gap. It allows economic exploitation. It allows you to increase the wealth gap. It's good and bad all the time. There's no point in arguing whether it's one than the other. It's both. We just have to accept that. Works better in some places sometimes, works worse in some places sometimes. That's just how it goes. We get more affordable stuff. We get more cheaper stuff. We get more innovation. We get a lot of good and bad things. So whether you see it positively or negatively, it's comfortable for us in our culture to see it as a thing that we made as humans, right? Even around the world, but we made it. Even if flawed, it benefits us. We made it, and it gives us advantages, and they outweigh the disadvantages, most people would say. We don't necessarily, though, even though we have no problem sort of believing that, we don't necessarily see it as an agent of historical change in itself. And that is absolutely central to how the history is used in this book, because it's trying to establish the historical agency of this world ecology of capital. So you might be saying, well, as I alluded to before, it's people that are doing these things, right? Whether it's Columbus or someone else or some other banker or so on and so forth. It's people doing stuff. And this is not a novel suggestion. We talk about nations all the time, right? We know that nations as political abstractions aren't going around and doing stuff. There's not like the US and Germany, it's people. It's actual human beings making policies, making decisions, fighting, shooting guns at each other, dropping bombs, making agreements, working together, whatever the case is. But it's particular people doing things that get represented as nations, right? But in this kind of book, capitalism is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just people making capitalist decisions, it's the whole system. And obviously people are doing stuff. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question, obviously. But it's very important for this book that capitalism itself is kind of this system that we have to think about, rather than just individual companies, corporations, governments, marketplaces, etc., making decisions, right? It's a complex ecological system. And we have to think about it that way. We have to see it or contemplate it in that way, or we can't possibly make the changes that they think we need to make. So here's the catch 22, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a whole string of things for a book like this. The authors of this book see an impending environmental crisis. And if I don't know how many of you sort of have the physical book, you see the cover a lot more often on a physical book than the ebook. A guide to capitalism, nature, and the future of the planet, right? So that's clearly their main concern. So they see an impending crisis there, and to solve it, in their view, we need to think very systemically, and we need to think holistically and big picture about capital in general. We can't think just about environmental change. We can't think just about solving any one of the cheap things, improving care, improving work, improving nature. These are all part of it, but we have to think very broadly. And to prove that, to really sell that point, What do? They use history to show this long precedent, to give more weight to their suggestion. And in doing this, they note that the way they make this sort of this argument is by creating this series of crises, capital crises, right? So they have to show lots of historical examples to convince us. And you might not be convinced, again, that's sort of irrelevant, but I'm just wanting us to pay attention to how they're using history. They create these cycles of crisis, right? So it's got this, it's not just linear, right? It's ongoing. We're going to come to the next crisis eventually. It might be in 5 years, it might be in 50 years, but it's coming. What's going to happen? Well, typically these crises have been resolved through capital flows driven in a large part by cheapening of certain things through the development of new frontiers or wars or other things that lead to sort of new frontiers. Or you could think of digital technology as a frontier in itself. Whatever the frontiers are, there might be more. Talked about this in the last video briefly. It's a philosophical discussion in itself of is there ever going to be an end to frontiers as long as we're a creative species that comes up with new stuff. Again, whether or not you buy their whole argument, I want you to be aware of how they're making their argument via history. And to make this argument about these crises and these frontiers and so on, and cheapness, they have to establish that the frontiers have been important historically and developed this sort of capitalist world ecology that has become this giant system that has its own historical agency, and we need to think about that whole system. And the proof that we need to think about that whole system, rather than just pointing out, hey, we need to think about this whole thing, is look at the history. So in order to show that there's these cycles and frontiers and crises and so on, they go through lots of historical examples. They have to take a super broad view of history, right? Which makes for really sloppy history, right? Very broad leaps in causality. Proof is basically impossible. We talked about proof last video. I'm not going to go into that again. That can be okay, but it's also kind of deviant from the way we think history should be written. They seem to make up for these historical lapses with questionable and strident claims from limited historical examples. There's this sort of activism, like anti-capitalist vibe that kind of runs through it. I don't think they actually are anti-capitalist in my view, but there's clearly this kind of like, we're wrecking things and you reader need to fix it, right? So that rubs people the wrong way pretty understandably. And of course, it's always impossible to prove what their sort of premise is, which is that there is this sort of capitalist system that is a historical actor in itself, that it has shaped history in itself as opposed to just people and places making certain decisions. And that's a matter of interpretation. So if we give it that both generous and critical reading, then what are we left with? Again, I think this is sort of representative of a lot of similar kinds of books that, again, extreme example here to make the issues clearer. But we should be asking these kinds of questions about how is history used? Is it necessary? What is being proven? What needs to be proven? What is a suggestion? What is a new perspective? How much weight do we want to give these different chapters? Again, which I think are very uneven in their convincingness. So what can we really take away from this book then, reading it generously and critically? Does it have significant implications for problem solving or how to make the world better? We all have our definitions of better in that case. But what should we take away from this in terms of how it uses history? Again, I think it's the perspective of how do we go about solving problems? Where do we want to put our attention? Where do we want to focus? And their view is we don't want to focus on any one of these things. These are all important. But we can't focus on any one of them because they're embedded in this world ecology and we have to think about them as a system. And this is going to give us the ability, this is in their conclusion, to interact with the web of life differently. And so in order to, give more weight to that view, and that's all this book is about, right? Interacting with the web of life differently. That's the whole point. If you had to summarize that in, 10 words or whatever, why is the lighting so crazy? I guess it's a little bit cloudy. One sentence summary, interact with the web of life differently. That's what this whole book's about. Tons of history to show you that there's no other way. It's historically embedded in everything around us. They give us, and so really the ultimate takeaway is just a matter of perspective and awareness. They have some short paragraphs at the end, action items of things we should do, things we have to do differently. I disagree with a bunch of stuff on that list, but the first one I agree with 100%. Recognition. We have to understand the system around us and how, or to what extent, it's been shaping us. To what extent is it a historical actor in itself? To what extent has it had historical and contemporary, present day agency in shaping the world that we have to keep in mind as we're trying to reshape it? Recognition is the primary thing. In other words, to loop back to an earlier video, we have to ask ourselves, how's the water? However you answer, however you describe the water, however you might reject those water around us, cold, warm, right, currents blowing in our face, pushing us, however you want to interpret the water around us, I hope you will take a critical and generous view of whatever history you read and ask questions of not only how does it fit in a historiographical perspective, right? You can do that at this point pretty easily. You've read enough, you've written enough to be able to do that, but ask these questions about why is history being used? What is it really doing in this book? Whatever the book is, not just this one. Are the authors using it appropriately, not just making a historical argument or not just proving something happened or something, there's a process in history, but are they really using history effectively? Is it necessary? What does it gain them as authors to use it this way? Does it help? Does it hurt? Critical and generous reading. Even when we totally disagree with how they've done it, is there still something we can take away? Is there still some valuable perspective we can put in the viewfinder, right? That's my 2 cents anyway. Weekend is just around the corner, like a few hours now, I think. I look forward to your delayed posts on Monday. And again, the next assignment will be delayed a few days until the following Monday, the last week of the semester, where there's otherwise nothing for this class. A final due, a normal length essay final due the last day of finals week, May 14th, I believe. Take care.